So the topic of trauma and recovery in contemporary literature. And in March 2019, we organized a conference at the Catholic University of America. And during the conference, we organized 2 panels on world literature, 1 panel on Francophone literature, and a roundtable on childless women and monstrous mothers. And we also had a film screening, an Italian documentary with Nicoletta Nesler, who was present at the Catholic University of America. And we had the screening of the Lunàdigas documentary, or Concerning Childless Women. And 1 week later, so it was a very productive week we had in March 2019. 1 week later, we met again at the Northeastern Modern Language Association in Washington, D.C., where I had the opportunity to organize 2 roundtables on new representations of motherhood in contemporary literature and society. And with Nathalie, we really discussed about the overwhelming interest that was raised by the call for papers for our conference and the roundtable at the Northeast Modern Language Association. And we decided that there was a kind of urgency to really produce a volume on this topic. That's why we decided to follow up with a volume that discussed the topic of the trauma, of motherhood and trauma, from an transnational perspective and from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I'm not going to say too much about the volume, since Nathalie is going to introduce the structure of the volume, but I would like to spend a few words about the online supplement, since we also decided to do something probably different from what had been done before. We really wanted to accompany our volume with an online creative supplement, because we thought that this creative supplement could enhance the conversation we had and open up some issues that were raised by the chapters by engaging with those topics in a non-academic mode. That's why we decided to offer also a creative section, which is composed of texts that have been written especially for this publication, followed by a selection of previously published texts that have been translated into English for the first time for this publication, so that also English-speaking readers can enjoy those texts and excerpts. We also decided to have some interviews with the authors and directors who participated in the creative project, because we wanted to really create a virtual roundtable so that we could continue to discuss some of the topics that were urgent and controversial, related to trauma and stigma connected to the experiences of infertility, miscarriage, assisted reproductive technology, childlessness, and surrogacy, among others. So I will stop for now. So Nathalie, if you want to introduce the volume and the aspects related to trauma and motherhood studies.
Thank you, Laura. So yes, I'm going to talk about putting together trauma and motherhood studies. My work since my dissertation for the PhD has been about motherhood and trauma in the context of genocide, in Holocaust studies and the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So, which is a very little studied aspect of genocides, more precisely infanticide, childlessness, giving birth in genocidal circumstances. And so trauma studies have been on the rise since Cassie Caros's publication of unclaimed experience in the 1990s. But motherhood studies themselves are already an understudied aspect of feminist studies, for instance. They remain like a dead angle of feminist studies. And same thing with trauma. Usually trauma studies are not apply to motherhood studies. So we felt with Laura that by bringing those two areas together, we would really, our volume would help shed some new critical light on some aspects of motherhood studies that are not usually too much discussed or too visible in current academic circles. So yeah, so this is how we decided to have this theoretical orientation. So we are very grateful to Palgrave for letting us publish this volume with them, because it's always tricky to find publishers. As some of you may know, in motherhood studies, there are very few publishers that are known to publish books on this area. Maybe 2 or 3 of them come to mind, and that's it. Because obviously motherhood studies is not considered as academic or as worthy of interest as other areas. And same thing for trauma studies in some ways. So, because I can see that time is already going by really fast, I will just now talk briefly about how we organized the volume, which was not easy. It's always tricky when you put together various essays to find cohesion and how to organize it best. So the way we approached it, we divided into 3 parts. And the first part is about trauma surrounding pregnancy, childbirth. So the preconception and conception part of motherhood. And then the second part focuses on the disrupted mother-child bonds. So this has more to do to the postpartum experience of birth. Sorry, I'm still admitting people from the waiting room while I talk, so it's a little bit tricky. And the last part, the third part, is about the new challenges surrounding assisted reproduction technologies. So surrogacy, IVF, donor insemination, and even artificial wombs, which is also a very little discussed topic surrounding motherhood in the 21st century. So without further ado, I will move on to our first presenters. So now we are going to move on to part 1, which is pregnancy, childbirth, and trauma. The first chapter in this section is by Giulia Rogers from Maynooth University in Ireland. The title of her chapter is Understanding the Trauma of Pervasive Pregnancy Denial in L'Enfant que je n'attendais pas, which is a French movie about denied pregnancy. However, Giulia was not able to make it with us today, unfortunately. So the second chapter in this section is by Mary Catherine Foltz. Mary Catherine is she's an associate professor of English and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Lehigh University. I hope my pronunciation is correct. She's the author of Contemporary American Literature and Experimental Culture, American Shit, at Palgrave as well in 2020, and that sounds extremely interesting. So the title of her chapter is Salvaging the Bones Means Fighting for Reproductive Justice. Jasmine Ward's literary representations of the trauma produced by attacks on reproductive rights, comprehensive sex education, and access to health care. It's your, so yeah, go ahead.
I think, Nathalie, that you're telling me to go ahead. But if I'm cutting you off, will you please accept my apology? You were sort of breaking up for a minute on my screen. So I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm so glad to be here today. Congratulations to all the contributors, the editors. The volume is truly incredible. And I really wanted to take a moment just especially to highlight our editors, Laura and Nathalie. Thank you so much for all that you did to bring the collection together. It was really my privilege to be a part of this. As Nathalie said, my essay for this collection focuses on Jessamine Ward's novel, Salvaging the Bones. In this essay, I'm kind of engaging with how other critics have positioned the novel. Some have said it's an important indictment of the US government's lack of responsiveness to impoverished communities in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, the storm that really threatens the protagonist and her family in this novel. Other critics have powerfully argued that the novel focuses on the resiliency of Black communities and families as they come to each other's aid during times of disaster, and just the trial of poverty in the absence of strong social safety nets in the United States for working class people. So I agree with these critics, but I build from their assessments to argue that Ward's novel also should be seen as one of the most important 21st century US novels to reflect upon maternal mortality and healthcare for pregnant women and their children. Indeed, as the protagonist, whose name is Esh, is pregnant in the days leading up to the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, the novel highlights many challenges that she faces, from being unable to access the termination of a pregnancy, something that she considers in the early part of the novel, but she doesn't even know how she would make it to the one abortion clinic in Mississippi, let alone for youth under the age of 18. There's a 24-hour waiting period, so she'd have to find money for a hotel. She would need parental permission, a signature by a parent to terminate a pregnancy. There's all these kinds of restrictive legislation in the US that make abortion an option she simply cannot choose. She does not have that choice in the novel. But the novel also addresses, even as she has to carry the pregnancy to term, the lack of prenatal care that she receives. And in backflashes, we learn about her mother's death during pregnancy that has left her and her siblings without a strong maternal figure. So I position the novel within the theoretical frameworks offered by scholars of reproductive justice and within the historical context of Mississippi's inadequate sex education programs, prohibitive legislation, as I already mentioned, around access to abortion, and failing healthcare systems that supposedly should support low-income women as they seek prenatal and then postnatal care. And because the novel focuses on a Black mother who dies in childbirth, it also is engaging with the high rates of maternal mortality for Black women in the US. So the novel is really critiquing that phenomenon that we have in this country. So while Ward's novel does highlight issues targeted by reproductive justice advocates, she also attends to the ways that Black women and Black communities broadly step in to salvage each other from systemic neglect and to build networks that can meet the needs of their community's most vulnerable members, including teenage mothers. So that's just a little bit. I hope I was in the 2 minutes, 2 to 4 minutes. That's just a little bit about my essay. Thank you so much for letting me share some of the main arguments there. And it's going to be a pleasure to hear all the other contributors discuss their pieces as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary. I apologize if you don't hear me well. I realize my internet connection is really logged out of the Zoom after introducing Mary. So now the third chapter in the first part is by Holly Runde. Holly is a lectrice, so a language assistant teacher at the Université Paris-Est Créteil in France. And she completed her PhD in French in 2018 from the University of Virginia. So her chapter is titled Social Trauma and the Anti-Maternal Body in Diana les Épaules. So Holly, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. I echo all of Mary's thanks to the editors and to all the other contributors. It's a delight to be here and to have participated in the volume. So as I note in my chapter, the 21st century has seen the ways in which we reproduce, we choose not to, who owns the products of our reproduction, was able to reproduce in the first place, diversifying in often remarkable ways. However, pushback to novel reproductive paths has not manifested itself in a uniform manner across the Western world. For example, as a number of US states are set to effectively render abortion illegal, even far-right candidates here in France like Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour, who are up for the first round of the presidential elections this weekend, wouldn't dare touch that subject on a public stage. On the other hand, I became fascinated as an American researcher in Paris with the anti-surrogacy and IVF chalk stamps that littered the streets in certain neighborhoods circa 2017, procedure that's viewed as mostly benign among the general public in the United States. And now that I'm here full-time in the Paris region, I can say that these street chalk stamps have far from disappeared. In conversations with French feminists, both academic and personal, I found that the sentiment that surrogacy was a procedure whose inherent anti-feminism was grounds for keeping it outlawed was and has remained widespread. So it was this international disconnect in regarding the ethics of new reproductive technologies that drove me to first study the cultural mechanisms that have grounded surrogacy's controversial status as what could be called a traumatic breach of the traditional family within contemporary France. During that investigation, I came across Fabien Gorgeau's feature film, Diana les Épaules, which uses the surrogacy motif to paint a picture of a woman who is morally unburdened by her status as a surrogate, refusing this socially traumatic designation that the French cultural context attempts to impart onto this role. So importantly, while French social policy states quite firmly that surrogacy is an inherently traumatic procedure that cuts a woman off from a child she's necessarily bonded with, or at the very least that commodifies her body, Gorgeau's film actively rejects this paradigm. Rather, the trauma of his protagonist Diane stems from the loss of agency that pregnancy brings, as those around her dictate how she should feel about her pregnancy. In the film, the cultural scripts for pregnancy and motherhood override Diane's own lived experience as a surrogate carrier, robbing her of the personal agency to define her individual relationship to her womb and its contents. Though Diane attests to her true feelings and acts without hesitation regarding the pregnancy, the film lays out the consequences of the lack of a sociocultural template for a woman who carries a child without emotional attachment in the French context. By privileging her viewpoint as protagonist of his film, giving us extensive insight into the minutiae of her pregnancy, Gorgeau impels the viewer to accept Diane's lack of maternal instinct as valid and believable. And through this, I argue that the viewer is brought to recognize the ultimate identitarian difference between a gestator, someone who carries a child, and a mother. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Holly. So we're going to move to part. Nathalie, can I go ahead?
Oh, yes, sure, go ahead.
Sorry,
it keeps cutting.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. I think there is an issue from time to time. I hope you can all hear us. So we can move to part 2, Trauma and Disrupted Mother-Child Bond. Giulia Podelail is not here today, unfortunately. She's sick with COVID, but she sent her paper. So I'm gonna read her paper. Giulia Podelail is associate teaching professor and coordinator of Italian language and culture at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And her paper, her chapter, is on trauma behind bars, maternal dilemma in Rossella Schillaci's Ninna Nanna Prigioniera. And I'm going to read her paper that she just sent us. My paper examines Rossella Schillaci's documentary Ninna Nanna Prigioniera from 2016, which investigates the life in confinement of a young Roma mother named Yasmina and her daughter Lolita inside the Lorusso Cotugno prison in Turin. According to Italian law number 354 from 1975, convicted mothers with children age 3 or under are allowed to keep their babies in prison. The government has modified the law multiple times, and the adjustments to the law were written with the growing awareness that children's rights and freedom have to come first. An important modification was done in 2011 with the creation of new structures called ICAM, special housing units for pregnant women and mothers with children under the age of 6, which ultimately remain confined spaces, but have no cells, no bars, and staff who does not wear uniforms. Today, there are a few ICAM structures in Italy, but when Rossella Schillaci worked on the production of her documentary, Turin had not yet completed the creation of an ICAM structure. So the scenes were filmed within a regular female ward of the prison called Nido, an enclosed environment made slightly cozier with bright colors and furniture for the kids. Schillaci discloses the intimate maternal dilemma of a mother who is not willing to place her daughter in foster care because she wants to see her grow, and also questions the children's experience and the impact that imprisonment might have on their development. Inside the jail, Schillaci remains an absent presence behind the camera, but her observational approach intermingles with a peculiar use of the camera that conveys an alienating representation of space and time. The slow passing of time is marked out by the meals, the steps on the main hallway, the sunsets and the rain seen through the iron grating, the screams of other inmates. The space is claustrophobic, with recurrent images of multiple doors and cell bars, close-ups and the hands holding the bars, keys that open and close the cell doors, plates, pacifiers, stink bugs. The use of montage sequences offers poetic and subjective perspectives that gradually reveal the compelling urgency to privilege children's freedom and find better solutions to prevent the traumatic experience of incarceration and separation for both the mother and the child. What I argue then is that Schillaci eschews moralizing, but the cinematographic techniques that she uses show that prisons are an unsuitable environment, too constrained to allow the proper development and well-being of a child, as well as the mental and emotional stability of the mother, who consequently becomes unable to tend to her child. The history of Yasmina and Lolita and their life inside the prison stands as an example of a traumatic bonding experience that deteriorates through the months. Yasmina's attempt to forge a connection with her daughter turns into emotional frustration and anger toward the justice system. The recovery from the maternal trauma is partially achieved when Lolita leaves the prison, but it can only be completed when the mother and the daughter will be able to reunite outside the prison, which is something the director does not show us, probably as a way to advocate for the needs of further prison reform. So this was Giulia's presentation. She's not here today, so if you have questions, you can get in touch with her later on. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions. So now I will move on to the next chapter, which is written by María Aghasi, who is assistant professor at the American University of Sharia in the United Arab Emirates. And the title of her chapter is Pour dire la souffrance des innocents, problematics of the Madonna-son trope in representing trauma in Philippe Aractingi's Under the Bombs and Nadine Labaki's Capernaum. Maya, whenever you're ready, you can start your presentation.
Hi, forgive me, I'm a little tired. It's 30 p.m. here in
imagine.
Sharjah. Okay, so my chapter is a little different. So I was actually looking for representations of motherhood, mainly because of my personal experience with all these reproductive processes. And I got a little frustrated because, so my background is I'm Lebanese and I'm interested in Lebanese literature and culture. And what I ended up finding is a lot of the representations of motherhood ended up being within the like traditional paradigm of the Madonna and the Son. And so what I was investigating is the problematics of representing trauma through that trope. So I chose the first film, which is actually it's a great film. It's almost a documentary film about the 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. The Lebanese call it the July War. And what the director, Philippe Araktinji, did was he actually ended up taking real life footage and used that in his fictional film. And then the second film I chose is Nadine Labaki's Capernaum. It was huge when it came out in Lebanon. It was only the second film in Lebanon to ever be nominated for the Academy Award for Best International Film. And it was a really big hit, but also subject to a lot of criticism because of the way it represents poverty. But essentially what I show is the trauma or the subsequent trauma of the 2006 war in Lebanon could only be conceived through the separation of a mother and her son. And even though the mother is a Muslim, the trope of the Madonna and Son, the Christian Madonna and Son, keeps coming up again and again. And that's how the emotive effect is produced by the film. And then similarly in Capernaum, it's about an undocumented Ethiopian worker in Lebanon who ends up giving birth to a child who in real life is actually a girl, but in the film is a boy. So I think that works towards the image of the mother, the Madonna and the Son. But anyway, because she's undocumented, she gets arrested and then her son gets left alone to be raised by another child. And so the Ethiopian mother who's put in prison is, kind of idealized, like she's a goddess, she's a good mother, and the way her godliness or idealization is depicted on screen is she's constantly nurturing her child. She breastfeeds her child. And I actually think it's a very powerful image of her breast, like when she's in prison, her breasts get really engorged and she tries to empty them out because the baby isn't there to feed. So it's a really moving scene. But on the flip side, there's another mother who has a lot of children and she's just poor and she's just trying to get rid of her children by selling them off into marriage, right? Child marriage. And so in the end of the film, this mother who, not the Ethiopian mother, the mother who doesn't really nurture her children, right? She doesn't really feed them. She ends up challenging the director, who's also an actress. So she's an actress in the court scene, and she's the lawyer defending the children. And she challenges her and she tells her, what would you do in my situation? And the problem is there is no answer. It's complete silence. And so what I end up saying is the culture cannot conceive of motherhood outside of this nurturing kind of idealized Madonna figure, and how problematic that ends up being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. And the last chapter of part 2 on trauma and disrupted mother-child bonds is written by Fang Tang, who is not here today, unfortunately, for health issues. She could not attend our meeting, but Fang Tang is associate professor in the School of Humanities at Yangtze University in China, and her chapter is on traumatic memory and narrative healing in contemporary diasporic Chinese-British women's writing. So now we're going to move on to part 3 that will be introduced by Nathalie.
Okay, so part 3 is about the new challenges with assisted reproductive technologies. So the first chapter in that part is by Brian Betancourt, who unfortunately cannot be with us today either. It's titled Tragedy in Vitro, the Function of Reproductive Science in Simon Stone's adaptation of Yerma. So it's about theater. The second chapter is by Sarah Fisher-Davis, who is with us today. So So Sarah is a PhD candidate in English at Stony Brook University, unless this has changed since then, no. So the title of her chapter is I Have an Enterprise, Transnational Surrogacy, Neoliberal Repropreneurship, and the Potential Trauma of Clinical Labor in Zippy Brun Frank's Google Baby. So Sarah, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I just want to echo everyone's sentiments. Thank you to our wonderful editors, and I'm just really excited to be here today. Hopefully that status of candidate will change by the end of this year. That's the hope. I just wanted to note that I worked to edit and finalize my chapter while pregnant with and just after giving birth to my first child, who was born last February. So this topic has taken on new significance for me over the course of this project, and is one reason that I'm very excited to be a part of it. So perhaps the most telling scene in Google Baby, which is the documentary I use as my primary object of analysis, shows Doran, the Israeli businessman and parent whose reproductive enterprise gives my chapter its name, talking directly to the audience and not as a confident entrepreneur as we see him in other parts of the film. Instead, Doran paces while questioning his role in transnational surrogacy and a confused, almost contrite admission of doubt about its and his integrity. After consulting with 3 different clients about implanting multiple embryos in 2 different surrogates simultaneously, the Israeli father turns to the camera and confesses, something instinctively sounds a bit weird. I am very, very involved, or I was very, very involved in my pregnancy. Now I see that people are very happy to be free of those concerns. Each client ultimately agrees to the implantation and thus values seemingly this product over process, a result that does not sit well with Doran. While he remains committed to helping fellow gay couples and others become parents through ART, he challenges the aloofness of their procedure, emphasizing his desire for intimacy despite the obvious biological limitations on his own participation. For this brief moment, Doran steps back and considers his entrepreneurial process and the risk of trauma for mother workers through the eyes of the American egg donor and Indian surrogates, which are the perspectives I focus on in my analysis. Zippy Brand Frank, director of the documentary, insists Dr. Patel and her surrogacy clinic, which are kind of the primary location of much of the film, adhere to a very feminist agenda, yet the clinic's representation in Google Baby both challenges and reinforces transnational business feminism and womenomics, terms that I define and explicate further in my chapter. While entrepreneurship allows for some social and financial recovery for lower class women and women of color, the same neoliberal ideal also underscores the inequality between differently gendered, raced, and classed persons, an inequality upon which the system relies. Increasingly disembodied shots of the individuals involved in this transnational surrogacy process, their faces, their abdomens, their hands, reflect the increasingly commodified and traumatized bodies of non-male, non-white economic subjects, bodies which are exposed to physical and emotional suffering through the very process they believe will lead to a better life, and it often does. Thus, Google Baby visually represents this paradox of reproductive economics. Abby Rabinovitz alleges the surrogacy experience is often framed in a binary in which the women are cast either as winners of a life-changing sum of money or as victims forced by their poverty into renting their wombs. So Frank's film seems to encourage what Levy refers to as a both-and position, which promotes a space to acknowledge agency while at the same time not downplaying the influence of some of these oppressive social structures and discourses. Various other sources agree, recognizing the potential for exploitation of both contracted parents and children, while rejecting claims that surrogacy, particularly in the transnational context, is a form of victimization rather than work, which is something that I think through in examining clinical labor as a concept. So this both and of repropreneurship allows for trauma and recovery concurrently, even for the same female, whether as a surrogate in Anand, India, or an egg donor in Beach Bluff, Tennessee. By literally zooming in and out with her camera, I argue that Frank captures the uneven division of clinical labor and interrogates the erasure and trauma of specific bodies within reproductive economics, encouraging her audience to reconsider entrepreneurship and challenge their own perceptions about what it means to work as a contracted mother. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And the last chapter in this section and in the volume is by María José Gutiérrez. So María she received a PhD in Hispanic literature and cultures from the Catholic University of America. The title of her chapter is No Trauma for Artificial Women, Monstrous Cybernetics and Anomalous Mothers in Current Latin American Science Fiction.
Thank you. I first want to join the words of gratitude to our editors and congratulations to the rest of the contributors. My research explores the historical representation of artificial women known as women cyborg or genoids in current Latin American science fiction narrative and film. In these narratives, women cyborgs have been traditionally portrayed as a submissive and sexualized fetish intended to be used as the object of male pleasure. In my chapter, drawing from Donna Haraway's concept of cyborg as an icon or metaphor able to break down traditional boundaries and binaries, I argue that when artificial women and mothers are conceived and represented from a gender perspective, far from being a submissive woman or a child-producing machine or a technomem, the cyborg is recognized as a metaphor that empowers women and liberates them from the oppression and trauma originated in patriarchal structures. For that purpose, I examine a group of short stories written by women, and I compare them with others written by men. And this is an ongoing project, so I keep funding new texts that can be added to this group. In this text, the women cyborg, when the woman cyborg become an icon that liberates women and also turns them in these women that also be conceived from current theoretical frameworks as monsters, and their motherhoods become the bodies of resistance. So in this cyborg is working these narratives from a feminist perspective as a bodies of resistance, able to free themselves, the woman itself, from these patriarchal structures and the trauma that they carry out because of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, María. So now I will let Laura introduce the creative part of our volume.
Thank you, Nathalie. I have already introduced how the creative part was conceived. Now we're gonna listen to the contributors who contributed to the creative part. The creative part is divided in 4 different chapters, 4 different parts. The first one on the lasting trauma of miscarriage and infertility features an interview with Alexandra Kimball, who's not here today. Alexandra Kimball is a Canadian writer and journalist who also wrote an essay on feminism and infertility, and she discusses miscarriage, infertility, and third-party reproduction in her work and in her interview. The second part is on healing the trauma of IVF and features Eleonora Mazzoni's work. Eleonora is an Italian writer and actress, and she has addressed the topic of trauma and infertility and IVF in her novel, Le Difettose. And for this creative part, she has written a text that was specially written for the creative volume, and some excerpts of her novel, Le Difettose, have been translated for the first time in English by Adalgisa Giorgio, who is honorary lectureship in Italian studies at the University of Bath, and by Eliana Maestri, who is senior lecturer in translation studies and director of the Center for Translating Cultures at the University of Exeter. And they are both here today. So you're gonna present your work, Eleonora, and the translating work. You have about 10 minutes to do so. And whenever you're ready, you can start and share your presentation. Eleonora, Adalgisa, Eliana.
Good evening. I think we decided that I start with reading a passage from the essay, and then Eleonora will move on with a passage from the novel in Italian, and then Eliana will read the same passage in English. So here we are. The passage is about the emotions women go through when they are diagnosed as infertile. When a diagnosis of infertility is unexpectedly flung at us, we are hurled into a tangle of emotions that is difficult to unravel. Used as we are always to be in control and always to be the winners, we imagine that we can obtain, eventually, and with a bit of effort, everything we desire. We are, therefore, surprised, astonished, almost incredulous, when we discover that we are inadequate to perform what is apparently the simplest thing in the world. We get angry, despondent, frustrated. We feel resentful. We don't think we deserve such an unfair treatment. We see ourselves as the missing link in a centuries-old chain. We feel excluded from the flow of life. We don't know who to blame. Sometimes we blame ourselves, other times our partner or fate. We lose our usual self-esteem. We drown in a pain as intense as when we suffer a bereavement. The loss of a potential life, of a child who has never existed except in our thoughts, cannot easily be shared with others. But if it remains unspoken, if it is lived in solitude, without consolatory rites, it can unleash a sense of incompleteness so strong that it may even trigger suicidal thoughts. Moreover, in archaic societies, pregnancy and birth were considered propitious events, associated with fecundity of land and abundance of crops, whereas infertility, like famine, was considered God's punishment. It was always the woman who was at fault, who was ostracized, who could be repudiated and replaced. These are centuries-old legacies which we, emancipated women, still carry on our shoulders. But today, there is a new aspect to the question. And so I now move on to the second theme on which I think it is useful to focus our attention, namely procreative practices in the third millennium. Our era has fought the atavistic punishment reserved to women with especially powerful weapons. In the past, we used to accept the pain caused by failed motherhood as inevitable, with resignation, whether we liked it or not. It was perhaps more tragic, but also simpler. Today's medicine has instead made tremendous strides, offering us new and unprecedented possibilities and bold solutions. Thank you. Eleonora, ci sei?
Grazie Adalgisa. Per noi fibettare le mestruazioni sono le rosse o le malefiche o le maledette. I ginecologi semplicemente igiene. I rapporti mirati, i compitini o le maratonate. Dopo il transfer degli embrioni facciamo la cova e al 10° giorno post-ovulazione cominciamo a sticcare. Non si rimane incinta, ma si becca la cicogna. Dentà anche, con un po' di disprezzo per le sue latitanze, la pennuta. Però quando la becchiamo, diventiamo carne della sua carne e ci incicogniamo. E giù sigle, PMA, ICSI, FIBET, IUI, PO, PM, PDG, VF, GEU. Sembriamo studentesse delle medie che parlano in codice per estromettere gli adulti da faccende che non capirebbero. Ogni giorno sui forum di donne che cercano un figlio mi impantano in chat in base, come i diari dell'adolescenza, di sfoghi, di confidenze brutali, di soccorso reciproco, di ragazze vi voglio bene, di brancolo nel buio ma grazie al vostro aiuto procedo, di ora sono triste e vuota ma per fortuna ci siete voi, alla faccia di tutti i dottorini senza cuore che erigono dighe per fronteggiare i nostri assilli di femmine che non riescono a procreare. Con il mio nickname Chicca75, che mi ha permesso di decapitare di netto 5 anni di età, ho scoperto che puoi adottare embrioni, cioè ospitare nella tua pancia un ovocita non tuo fecondato con lo sperma non di tuo marito. Puoi fecondare il tuo uovo con lo sperma di uno sconosciuto. Puoi fecondare l'uovo di una sconosciuta con lo sperma di tuo marito. Puoi fecondare il tuo uovo con lo sperma di tuo marito e affittare l'utero di una sconosciuta che partorirà tuo figlio. Se sei una lesbica accoppiata, si possono prelevare gli ovociti da una, fecondarli con lo sperma di un donatore e impiantarli nell'utero dell'altra. Se sei gay, puoi fecondare l'uovo di una donatrice con il tuo sperma, affittare l'utero di una donna e dopo 9 mesi portarti a casa tuo figlio con tanto di regolare contratto. Ma anche se sei single o non vuoi mogli e mariti, con un po' di soldi puoi fare un figlio da solo.
Okay, I'm now going to read our English translation. For us, IVFers, code red or nasties stand for menstruation. Gynos, simply for gynecologists. Homework of the marathon for timed intercourse. After the embryo transfer, we say that we sit on eggs. And on the 10th day after ovulation, we start to pee on a stick. In our language, we don't get pregnant. We are pecked by the stork, also referred to with a touch of disdain because she doesn't peck very often, as the feathered creature. And when she finally pecks us, we say that we become flesh of her flesh, and we are storked. And off we go with acronyms of all sorts: IVF, IUI, ICSI, EUP, ACU, PO, PM, PGD. We sound like schoolgirls speaking a secret language of our own to exclude grown-ups who do not understand our world. Every day, I get obsessively bogged down in online forums for women that are trying for a child. Their conversations sound like teenage diaries, pouring out frustrations, shocking secrets, mutual supports. Girls, I love you all. I'm fumbling in the dark, but thanks to you all, I go on. And now I'm sad and empty, but luckily you are all there for me. To hell with all those insensitive little doctors who erect barriers around themselves to block our worries and fixations of women who can't procreate. I have surfed the net as Kika75. The number is the year I was born, sort of. I have knocked 5 years off my age and found out that you can adopt embryos. That is to say, you can carry an egg cell that is not yours and has been fertilized with sperm that is not your husband's, or you can have your egg cell fertilized with the donor sperm of an unknown man, have an egg cell of an unknown woman fertilized with your husband's sperm, and have your egg cells fertilized with your husband's sperm, and then have it implanted into the rented womb of an unknown woman who will carry your child to term. If you're in a lesbian relationship, your eggs may be collected and fertilized with donor sperm and then implanted into the womb of your partner. Or if you are a gay man, the egg of a donor can be fertilized with the sperm and be implanted into the rented womb of another woman. After 9 months, you take home a baby, complete with official certificates. And if you're a single or don't want a partner, with a bit of cash, you'll be able to make a baby all by yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eleonora, Adalgisa, and Eliana for your presentation. Now we're going to move on to part 3, Maternal Trauma and Dystopian Literature. This part features Marta Baiocchi's texts. Marta Baiocchi is an Italian writer and scientist whose fiction stage dystopic reproduction narratives, and the texts have been translated by Marta Baiocchi herself for our publication and by Alice Worshow. Marta, when you're ready, you can start your presentation.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for organizing this nice event. And yeah, I wrote this book a few years ago based on the crossing between my experience as a cell biologist and my interest in the literature. So this is a book with thick plot, I would say. So there is this woman that cannot get any longer her embryos, because according to the Italian law, she cannot be implanted any longer with the embryos after her husband has died. So the doctor refuses the implantations. She recruits a biologist friend to find out what happens, and they eventually find out the embryos have been actually stolen. And the plot goes further to find out that they have been actually transferred to a faraway Asian country to do research on about out-of-womb pregnancies. And actually, rather than finding her embryos, she finds in a box her baby pretty close to be born. And so I will read you just a couple of pages translated from a part very close to the end of the book. And this Eva is the biology friend that has helped Bibi, the woman that had lost her embryos and that has now retrieved a full newborn baby. And so these are her almost final considerations. The plane for Italy took off with a violent rumble like the roar of a wild beast. Eva watched through the window as the city with its smog and skyscrapers and billboards shrank into forests and fields until the entire country disappeared. Up there, the sky was violet and infinite, a gigantic sun blushing deeply below. Some tenuous, exotic music plays on the speakers. When everybody does it, she thinks, when all babies are born in the petri dish, at first, people will be afraid. They'll say that it's contrary to nature, as if men were something distinct from nature, as if everything that is human and all human activity were not, by definition, the result of the same nature that produced and continues to produce them. They will say you cannot steal fire from the gods. that these children are the devil's offspring. They are cursed, and sooner or later they will be struck down. Damn the children and those that create them. Then, as time passes, nothing will happen to those children. Absolutely nothing. No lightning bolt will strike them. No curse will bring them down. The heavens are impassive, as they have always been. The children will be healthier than others because they were so costly and required so much attention. But women, it will be they who resolve the issue. Someone will do it because she doesn't want to quit working. Someone will do it because she can't quit working. Someone will do it because her body wants, and someone else because she doesn't want stretch marks. Then many will do it because everybody else around them is already doing it. In time, over the years, the idea of carrying a living being trapped within another body for 9 months will become frightening, disgusting, and even more unapproachable. And then Eva thought, in years to come, in some future that she can only attempt to imagine, even the idea of carrying a human being within the desires and the nightmares of some woman or man might become entirely unacceptable. Time might even bring women and men to fear the absolute power that nature gives to the powerful over the weak, the defenseless, the last of the absolute powers to survive in our civilized world. They will fear this nature that consigns new minds to be formed and informed to humans at random, blind and entirely unaware of the entity and the effects of their power, oblivious of the inextricable instincts that propel them toward the atavistic function of bringing up their young, new lives to pour and tap out just to gain vital energy for their own selves. Thus, in a future that is just barely discernible, the very idea of maternity will be cast aside like all bygone ways, like devotive pictograms painted on a rock 1,000,000 years ago, like a sacred stone in a paleontological museum, like a virus for which a vaccine has been found, like a disease eradicated from the earth.
Thank you, Marta. And now we're going to move to our last part and last presentation. The last part of the creative online supplement is on recovering from the stigma of childlessness and features the Lunàdigas project. So an interview with Nicoletta Nesler and Marilisa Piga, and some excerpts from Carlo Antonio Borghi's monologue on the Lunàdigas. In their projects, Nicoletta Nesler and Marilisa Piga aim at breaking the stigma associated with childlessness. And the texts written by Carlo Antonio Borghi for our online publication has been translated by Daniela Travaglini, who is a freelance translator and subtitler. And she is here tonight to present the Lunàdigas work, since she's also collaborating with the Lunàdigas project. Thank you, Daniela, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation. And Marilisa and Nicoletta, unfortunately, could not be here. So I'll be here on behalf of the whole of Lunàdigas. And as you said, I have translated and I've been collaborating with them for the past year. And as you mentioned before, Marilisa and Nicoletta are documentary filmmakers and authors. And they a few years ago in Washington, you met, and there was the screening of the documentary Lunàdigas, or about child-free women. And that was a project that's been on their mind for a long time, and they've been researching the condition of child-free women, especially in Italy. But then since the documentary traveled quite a lot through various festivals, they also went around the world. So basically, from that documentary, which was the big part of their initial work, there is, it gave life to a new project, which is something I've been involved with in the last year. And it's something we are very much passionate about. It's the live archive, because basically they have hundreds of interviews that they did before the documentary on the research work, on the field work, interviews of women in Italy and also men, and also people from around the world. So they used, of course, some pieces of each interviews to edit the movies. But there were all these interviews, which is a great wealth of experience, of stories of women about, their choice not to have children or not to have children for other reasons. So very intimate stories. So what they wanted to do is actually to create this live archive. It's an audiovisual archive, which is available to everybody through the website, which is lunàdigas.com. And each single interview comes with its own transcription, and it's translated and subtitled in English and Italian. So it's really accessible to a very, very wide audience. And this is a work that we keep feeding. Is like a work in progress, really. We keep feeding, every month with new interviews. And we are now finishing to work with the Italian interviews, and then we'll go on to the interviews that, they collected around the world when the movies, the film went through various festivals. So this is it's also actually opened, somehow widened also the intent. So at the beginning, it was mainly on childlessness or child-free women who chose not to have children. Then it opened up also to parenting in general, different forms of parenting. And also in the last couple of months ago, we published some interviews made to men. So we also have the voices and the stories and the perspective of men who chose or who don't have children. So it is a very it is really a very live project, because it keeps enriching itself day by day, and it keeps opening up to new vision. And the archive is really very thorough, and it's the way all the details, and it's really worth. I mean, I would really like to take this opportunity to invite you all to visit the website, which is lunàdigas.com, and stroll to the archive. So basically from the film where you met in Washington, from the initial documentary, which could have seemed like the final part of the project, it became the first part of a new project, which is this live archive, and which we are very happy about. And as you mentioned, in the supplement, in the creative supplement, we have we contributed with 3 monologues written by Carlo Borghi, and he's been all along part of the Lunàdigas project. He's been there, he's an author and performer, and he's been also one of the creative minds, along with Nicoletta and Marilisa, behind the Lunàdigas project from the very beginning. So, and I had the pleasure to translate them for this publication. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you all for your presentations. I just added the link, direct link for our online supplement. You can download it for free from the Palgrave website if you are interested. So feel free to go on the Palgrave website or use this link if you want to download the online supplement. Now, I think we have some time for questions. If you want to ask something to one of our contributors or to the translators, please feel free to ask your question by using the chat. Or what do you think, Nathalie? We are not that many. Probably we can also just ask our questions as you wish. What do you think, Nathalie?
Yeah, I think just raising your hand would be fine.
Yep, sounds good. perhaps since we don't yet have questions, I had a questions for the translator, since we didn't really have that much time to focus on your work, on your translating work. But if you have something you would like to tell something about your translations, since those texts were published for the first time, if you have anything to add, we wanted to really focus. We didn't have that much time during the presentation, and we wanted to focus on the contributions, but now you might have your chance to add something if you would like to add something about your work for this volume.
Sorry, for our part, Eliana's and my part, I think I'll let Eliana say something first, because she is the expert translator. I'll do it with instinct. She is the translation studies expert. Would you like to say something, Eliana?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Adalgisa. You are, your expertise is, you know, like a lot better than mine, but thank you for the compliment anyway. Probably, I mean, Adalgisa and I worked on the translation, and we liaised constantly. And for me, I mean, it was really helpful. When Laura asked us to share something about our translations, I thought more of the work I'm doing with my students. And the passage that I read out for you all, sometimes I work on it, actually every year I work on it with my students, and I asked my students to translate it. And what they like about the passage is the voice. And it's only if you really understand the text and you understand the point of view of the woman speaking, and speaking about IVF and her attempts, you know, to get pregnant, to try for a child. Only if you really step in her shoes, you can get the translation right. And so I'm speaking about you know, a translation point of view, you know, how to enjoy the text, not just to enjoy the text, but to understand the text. And Eleonora has beautifully written this text, but beautifully also from a narratological point of view, because to enjoy the text, you really need, and to appreciate the text, and therefore to translate it, you really need to step in the shoes of the speaking, the voice, and therefore feel what the woman feels. And I'm sure that, you know, Eleonora wanted her readers to do that, and she has, in my opinion, she has succeeded very well here. And I can see every time I translate the text with you know, my students, I can see that the ones that shine the most are the ones that can really, you know, understand the voice and the point of view. That's probably what you know, I'd like to say, and I'll give the floor to Adalgisa now.
I don't know whether I can add very much, but what I'd like to say is that one aspect of the text that was very interesting was the creativity in the language. For all those at the beginning of the passage we read, we had to create forms that translated a new, invented terminology that Eleonora has. In truth, I don't know whether those have been invented by her or are words that were really truly circulated in the clinics where all these women meet, or online when they say these things. Now, if I may say something very personal, I could step very well into that voice because I went through fertility treatment for some 7 years including the experience of IVF and ICSI and all that. So I actually knew all those acronyms, and there were new ones because obviously I went through it a long time before the protagonist. And so it was good to be able to step into, even linguistically, into those words, to be storked. But I have to say that Eliana was the more creative one than I was, and she was the one who came more with IVFers. So I thought that was something we did quite well. And I'd like also to add that we actually translated these sections of the novel for a workshop in London that took place in January 2013, which was part of a big network on motherhood in Europe. And Eleonora came for that day. That particular workshop of the network was about alternative motherhood. And Eleonora spent the day with us, and we translated again those passages. And we had to do them in a bit of a hurry because if I remember correctly, one of our students was supposed to do the translation, and then they didn't do it, and we had to do it last minute. And so when Laura, we didn't do anything with those passages, and so when Laura approached us and said, "Would you like to?" Eleonora has provided this translation, and it looks as if you did this translation. So actually, we redid them from scratch, and you can see, like 10 years later, you want to say things completely different, and that was something that kind of, I'm not a translator. I am, I do research in women's literature. I knew the book. I'd invited Eleonora for that workshop for that day because of her topic, and then because of the book was very good. And basically I felt, right, we have to start again. And it could be that it was because it was a long time later, and it could be because we did it in a hurry before, but it was interesting that I found that I would have said everything completely different. And I don't know whether a translator who reads a translation of a book 10 years later would want to redo it again. Yeah, so I wanted just to say something more a bit personal, and a bit, the language was what I found most interesting, and the variety. She moves between different registers, and then there is the nightly conversation that Eleonora's protagonist has with the philosopher, the Latin philosopher. Now I've got a blank. Who was it, Eliana? The philosopher.
No, the philosopher.
Eleonora, chi è il filosofo latino? Seneca, grazie. So Seneca. She has these conversations with Seneca, and so there are different, lots of different registers there, and makes the book so agile, so fruibile. You can be taken on so many different levels.
Thank you very much, Adalgisa and Eliana, for sharing this experience, also the personal part of your work and involvement. Are there other questions or comments or feedback?
And just want to say marvelous translation, Eliana and Adalgisa. It was really lovely. And also all you talked about. I want to just add something that I didn't mention before about the Lunàdigas, the word, the name. Basically, the word is a neologism. It's a word that the Nicoletta and Marilisa borrowed from the Sardinian language. Because investigating this condition of child-free women, especially in Italy, they couldn't find there isn't a word which can define a child-free woman without giving some negative expression or a lack of something or missing something. So there was not something assertive. And Lunàdigas in the Sardinian language is a word used by the Sardinian shepherd to indicate the sheep that in some seasons do not procreate. So they found this word, and it's funny that with a good dose of self-irony, but also the women who has been interviewed over the years, they all very happily adopted the word Lunàdigas. So now Lunàdigas is to actually define women who choose not to have children in a nice way and not in a negative, absence way. So that's a linguistic part which I didn't mention before, and it's worth to mention.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I think Ali Troiano said raise her hand. And Ali, I would like to thank you so much for your help and your assistant. She's our editor at Palgrave, and she's here. I think you raised your hand. You had a questions or a comment.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say how proud I am to have published this book for Palgrave. It's just kind of really exciting to hear all of you talk about your work. And I think one thing I was thinking about a lot for so many scholars and researchers, a big part of publishing is that you're hoping to make a greater impact with your research, kind of beyond maybe necessarily your immediate communities. And I'm kind of struck by how a book like this is really doing that. It's going beyond kind of just literary studies and intersecting with so many different areas. And what I've seen from the creative contributions as well, they're just a really great application of how this kind of research intersects with real life, I guess I would say. If anyone would want to comment on that in their own experience, I'd love to hear about that too, and whether you find that to be true, especially working in motherhood studies and trauma studies.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Does anyone wants to comment about that, about their experience?
Well, I'll just say, Ali, it's so nice to see you. We met at NEMLA years ago, and I'm just so appreciative for your work on this edited collection. Thank you so much. One of the things that I've been thinking about with motherhood and trauma, my wife and I, we just adopted our son, who is a teenager. He came to live with us when he was 15. And one thing that I think about in my life is trauma-informed parenting. We've taken multiple classes about being trauma-informed parents, especially adopting out of the foster care system in the United States. I think a lot about the kinds of systemic trauma that kids in the United States experience in our systems of care. And I don't know. I mean, that's something that I've thought about in relationship to my own work for this volume, but then just it's deeply personal. How do we think about structural change that will benefit children within our national context? And for me, that's the United States. How do we produce systems that don't consistently produce trauma for kids? And I think that is what our foster care system is doing to so many children in that, even though, we are a part of that system and we have been foster parents and now adoptive parents. How can we make better structures for kids? I think is a question that I'm interested in. And then trauma-informed parenting, how can that kind of parenting really shift our discussion about being good guardians for all of our kids, especially those that have survived trauma. Just a few thoughts.
Thank you, Mary. Anybody else would like to add something about that or ask another question?
I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting to think about how some of these essays could hopefully influence thinking on abortion rights, maternal death rates, IVF laws. I didn't know that there were so many laws limiting IVF in other countries. So I really hope that this kind of research kind of furthers that conversation and also highlights the literature that is contributing to these conversations too. So yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Ali. And I also think there are still taboos. Probably, I would say, probably in the Italian context, which is the context I know best, it is really a taboo. I have the feeling in the United States, we talk more about those topics, but it is still something that we don't really discuss publicly. And I really think that to change, and that was also one of the idea, I guess, behind this volume, the idea also to change the narrative and to show these stories that are usually not told or usually not spoken about. That's probably something that I'm really interested in, to change the narrative and break the taboos, since it's so frequent, but still not something that it is usually discussed or studied.
Yes, French culture is very similar to Italian culture. It's still very heteronormative. So IVF is for heterosexual couples that can show evidence that they've been together for 2 years. So recently they're trying to open it up to single and lesbian women, but this has been extremely controversial and people don't discuss it that much. However, in the United States, I find that it's talked about in some privileged circles, but it really depends. And it's also, okay, it's technically open to all, but you need to have money to do it usually. So, and it's extremely costly because in France, if they approve it, then in France, it's free right now. It's completely free, covered by the universal healthcare system. In Australia as well. So yes, this is, we really hoped with Laura to open up the conversation about that and see how this is translated into literature and films. Because usually popular culture is where things start moving because it makes the public opinion more aware of these issues. Sorry, someone, Adalgisa wanted to say something.
I was wondering, I'm not sure whether Eleonora feels confident to speak in English, but one of the themes in a book is precisely the fact that women keep their experience to themselves, and it's difficult to get through and share your experiences and find support. And I also heard her book has been very successful. They have done reprints. It's a long-selling book, and also it was made into a play. So I wonder whether Eleonora could perhaps tell us something about the impact her book might have had, or what kind of reactions the play may have had around the country. I don't know, Laura, if you want to ask her, because I'm not sure that she follows everything we say in English.
Eleonora, Adalgisa vorrebbe sapere se te la senti di dire qualcosa in inglese.
No, assolutamente.
Dillo in italiano magari.
Così Adalgisa può tradurlo. Se
Mi hai chiesto rispetto al fatto che è diventato una pièce teatrale, è stato ristampato.
Esatto.
Allora, no, ho capito, ma proprio così, giusto? Non capisco niente di inglese, lo parlo malissimo. No, è stato ristampato per la terza volta quasi un anno fa. È diventata una pièce teatrale che ha aperto il Festival della Mente di Sarzana nel 2014 e stiamo lavorando duramente alla serie televisiva, perché sulla serie televisiva cade l'asino, nel senso che ci sono ancora non tabù, comunque eppure sono stati comprati diritti televisivi da una società importante televisiva, però lavora per la Rai la RAI non accetta, ho scritto anche un soggetto di serie piuttosto scorretto, anche più del libro, assolutamente la RAI è impossibile. Bisognerebbe andare sulle piattaforme, ma le piattaforme ormai in Italia sono molto generaliste, cioè Netflix Italia o Amazon Italia è quasi come la RAI, cioè va su dei registri lineari, precisi, cioè per le famiglie, non è Netflix America, insomma è molto diverso. Adesso qui ci sarebbe da discutere, insomma, però io ho creato 4 personaggi diversi, 4 donne diverse che cercano di diventare madre, lo diventeranno in modo diverso, però sono temi, mi sono spinta anche oltre il libro sicuramente, insomma è da piattaforma, ma l'Italia, cioè, dovrei riuscire a farlo all'estero, ma è difficilissimo, insomma è impossibile perché il libro è italiano, insomma ci sono un po' di... Ma ce la faremo, secondo me ce la faremo. Però capisci anche tanta roba.
So probably just to sum up and to summarize, there is still a taboo. It appears to still be a taboo since it has been, the book there is a play now, it has been successful, but the TV series, it's almost impossible to realize, apparently the TV series in Italy, in the Italian context, on the public channels, but also on Netflix Italy, it's still probably a sensitive topic that it is still difficult to realize in the Italian context so far. But Eleonora, I mean, she's going to keep trying. But that's interesting, I think, because it's very different, I believe, from the US context, where those topics are more discussed. Yeah. Nathalie, we are at 4:32 p.m. my time, Est time. Shall we go ahead? Are there other questions? What do you suggest?
Sorry, Claudia is asking if the full translations for Mazzoni's and Baiocchi's novels are forthcoming.
It would be great. I don't think so yet, Eleonora.
La traduzione sei, diciamo,
in inglese.
In programma in inglese. No, devo dire no, purtroppo, perché è uscito in Francia, quindi in francese, però lo spettacolo teatrale è stato tradotto in tedesco e è andato in scena in Germania, e invece no, in Inghilterra o in America non è stato tradotto.
Ma la tua agente dovrebbe, o il tuo agente dovrebbe cercare...
Guarda, sono stata un po' sfortunata, devo dirti la verità, Adalgisa, perché quando ho pubblicato io con Einaudi, diciamo che c'era una persona che si occupava, era appena andata via una forte componente di Einaudi che traduceva molto per l'estero di italiano di Einaudi. E quindi c'era una persona che era diventata responsabile del settore traduzioni un po' meno brava, secondo me, e non si è data da fare abbastanza. Adesso quella che era in Einaudi, che si occupava della traduzione di Einaudi, è diventata un agente ed è diventata da pochissimo la mia agente per il mio prossimo libro. Quindi vediamo adesso che cosa potrebbe venire fuori. Sicuramente se si facesse la serie la traduzione ce la potrei avere, però adesso abbiamo appena piazzato sempre per Einaudi il mio prossimo libro, vediamo di riprendere il discorso della traduzione in inglese, avendo adesso un agente più forte.
E avendo anche una pubblicazione di alcuni brani.
Certo, infatti
potrebbe essere un incentivo.
Sì, sì.
Quindi chiedeva Claudia, she was also asking Marta Baiocchi about, so Eleonora, she said that it is not planned yet right now, but things might change in the future. So we hope so. And what about Marta Baiocchi? What about your book? Are there any plans for a translation?
I was contacted by some, not quite an editor, but some intermediaries for the American translation, and then it didn't come out at that time. I must say my book, the plot of the book was not focused, but depended very much on some very peculiar and irrational aspects of the former Italian law. So I understand that it could not be quite comprehensible for a foreigner public, and as a matter of fact, most of the Italian law, after I wrote the book, progressively dismantled. So as a matter of fact, also the basis of the plot wouldn't work the same way now as they worked on 2012. So this is a point I might understand, even though then several other aspects in the book, the desire for pregnancies, for motherhood, the new techniques to achieve motherhood are not always actual. But I believe that that point would be a problem for a foreigner reader. And I remember discussing with foreigners that were actually asking me, what you talking? They couldn't even quite understand why the law imposed some points, what might be the reasons behind that, if I made myself clear.
Se posso dire l'ultima cosa, no, mi dispiace molto questo fatto, perché quando è stato tradotto in francese, sono stata comunque 5 giorni in Francia a presentarlo. Ero ospite alla Comédie du Livre, che è una grossa evento editoriale francese, il secondo dopo quello di Parigi. Sono stata 5 giorni a fare presentazioni ed era impressionante vedere come le reazioni erano identiche all'Italia, cioè che la comprensione era totale, anche se era in Italia, ambientato prettamente in Italia, però poi cioè, i forum sono identici anche in Francia, comunque il tabù è identico, insomma c'è stata un'immedesimazione e quindi penso che in fondo anche lo spettacolo in Germania è andato molto bene, l'hanno ripreso 2 volte, sono anche delle difficoltà proprio del mercato editoriale italiano, che è difficile essere tradotti all'estero, insomma, però anche un po' scioccamente, non lo so, però appunto poi ci sono. Io spero ancora.
Are there other questions or aspects you would like to discuss? I don't see questions in the chat. I don't see any hands.
Stop. I have to run.
Nathalie?
Oh, yeah, no, sorry, I was saying I'm going to have to stop because I have to run to another meeting, and if I log out, I'm not sure if the meeting can go on.
Sure, but I think we are past, past 90 minutes. We had promised to finish in 90 minutes, so I guess we are done, but the record, right, Nathalie, will be available. We will we will let you know when it will be available, but it has been recorded, so if you want to share it with other people who could not attend the meeting tonight, it will be possible. And we can, of course, our idea was to really open a discussion, but we realized that there is still so much to tell and also so much to translate from what I understood tonight. So from my part, I would really like to thank Nathalie for organizing the meeting on Zoom, and everybody for participating, attending the meeting today, and contributing to the volume and to the online supplement, and also to our publisher and to Ali, who was here today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.